One shall stand, one shall fall.
Some blue tack would help with the whole standing and falling thing, but I guess you haven't developed the stealth armor yet. Welcome to the Fortress of Dorkness, the nerdy nexus for all your geeky needs. I'm your host, Christian Stank.
Are you Tony Stank?
Yes, this is Tony Stank.
Wrong, Stanmio! Oh, it looks like it's time to return to the MCU. Avengers Treasures is jumping right into it as we cover the next chronological film in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, 2008's Iron Man, which is technically the first film in the MCU by release, but let's be honest, only dumb E watches it that way. Interesting, since this was before the MCU was even conceived, the film doesn't have as many references to the larger Marvel Universe as one would think, making it unique among its brethren. We are going to cover some of our favorites, so just deal with it like Obadiah had to deal with Tony all those years.
I was the one who filed the injunction against you.
Let's start with the fact that this film was distributed by Paramount Pictures. Disney would purchase Marvel Comics in 2009, but Paramount would continue to distribute the MCU films until Disney picked up the slack from the Avengers in 2012. Paramount was still allowed to attach their logo to the front of Avengers and Iron Man 3 as part of the transfer. We meet Tony Stark, our hero, out in the Afghan desert where he is injured during an ambush on his convoy. And by Afghanistan, we mean the Lone Pine, California hills. In the comics, Tony's injury was received during the Vietnam War, and this is just one of many retcons that would take Tony through the Gulf War and then the Afghan War. And speaking of wartime, nothing says war like a sick beat to get shot at with. Music by AC/DC was used for this film, and would continue to haunt Stark. Haunt? For at least 2 more appearances by the Man of Iron. Maybe they got the currents switched up in other films. Several minor things of note also happen in this scene. Tony jokes with one of the soldiers in his convoy about throwing up a peace sign. Though this seems insignificant, it actually becomes a grim part of Tony's character, as he would adopt this symbol in many other appearances throughout the franchise. A further grim reminder of Tony's comic history is the glass of whiskey Tony is seen holding, as possibly Iron Man's most famous story, titled Demon in a Bottle, deals with Stark's alcoholism. This is a story that unfortunately won't happen in the films, but more on that later. With the future bleak, let's take a look at the past. Specifically, the first of 3 actors to take on the role of Howard Stark, Gerard Sanders, best known for playing Howard Stark, just this once. We'll get back to that when we reach Iron Man 2. Dominic Cooper was the younger Stark in Captain America: The First Avenger, as well as on the show Agent Carter, just as a refresher. Of note for viewers is the cover date of the Washington Times telling the deaths of Howard and Maria Stark as 17th December 1991. The actual date of their death, 16th December 1991, would play a pivotal part in the plot of Captain America: Civil War 8 years later.
Mission report, December 16, 1991.
All this is unlike Howard's partner Obadiah Stane, who has the honor of being the MCU's first villain who is never mentioned again. What is he, a Bond girl? Stane was the owner of Stane International in the comics, a rival corporation to Tony's, and did become the villain Ironmonger. Stane had been around since 1982's Iron Man 163, but didn't put on the suit until 1985 in Iron Man 200, where he also died. You know, a thought occurs, viewers. If Cap issue number 1 exists in the MCU, then an argument could be made that the rest of Marvel Comics exists in the MCU as well. Could Stane have looked up his own death to potentially avoid it?
Puzzle.
Of course.
Think about it, and get back to us in the comments. But who didn't die was Tony's friend, Colonel James Rhodes, aka Rhodey. Rhodes in the comics was a Marine and a Navy SEAL, whereas in the movie, he is a member of the US Air Force. Of note is actor Terrence Howard, no relation to Howard Stark, who played him in this film. But we'll get to that in another video. Whew, that was a lot of character intros. Can we jazz this up a little bit?
Now dig on this.
No. Just like this jazzy theme playing in the casino, which just happens to be a spiced up version of the 1966 Iron Man cartoon theme song. Take a listen for yourselves.
Tony Stark makes you feel he's a cool exec with a heart of steel.
Schnazzy, right? It shows up again as Rhodes' ringtone for Tony. Let's skip ahead to meet Happy Hogan, Tony's longtime bodyguard. Happy is played by the film's director, Jon Favreau. Fab facts, the Favs fought for RDJ as Stark, who Marvel was hesitant to cast because of his troubled past. I guess his skills not only as a director but a lawyer paid off.
It's in black and white. How can you be a skeptic?
If there's no eyewitness, I mean, Bigfoot has eyewitnesses.
Please.
The alligators in the sewer.
The alligators. So you're saying there are alligators in the sewer?
No.
You're changing your position on this one.
And direct Tony he does, as after some flirting, reporter Christine Everhart, a relatively minor character in the comics, meets Jarvis, a not so minor character. Jarvis stands for just a rather very intelligent system. Yes, that's real. He is the computer system that basically controls everything Stark Tech and more, which is the furthest departure from the comics thus far, as Jarvis is the human butler of the Stark family, who would go on to be employed at Avengers Mansion. The expanded MCU does address this by introducing him in Agent Carter, portrayed by James D'Arcy. Though the show was cancelled, one can assume Tony named his OS after his favorite manservant. It can also be assumed that it was his job to make sure Tony didn't become future mafioso.
Who are you talking to?
Future mafioso.
But what Jarvis can't handle, Pepper Potts can.
I do anything and everything that Mr. Stark requires, including occasionally taking out the trash.
Pepper is no more than a secretary in the early days of the comics, a product of the times, but over the years has been developed into a more fleshed out character, including getting her own suit of iron armor. One big change is the lack of love triangle between Potts, Tony, and Happy, a battle Happy actually won when he eventually married her.
Swish.
An interesting note is that Pepper is one of a line of Marvel redheads. I guess someone had a fetish. But she didn't start as one. In her first appearance, she was modeled after Ann B. Davis and had brown hair. Yes, that's the nanny from the Brady Bunch. The similarity was too close, so they switched her up from future appearances. Hey look viewers, see that car Tony is working on? That's actually director The Fav's 1932 Ford Model B. And boy, do those gas guzzlers play a part in the MCU, as this is the first time we see Marvel's collaboration with Audi, a car that Tony still drives to this day. And for good reason. Don't get a BMW or a Mercedes. Audi is the way to go. Living the big life is what Tony does best, and partying on a plane is just part of that lifestyle. The song heard in the background here, Slept on Tony with Dirt, was composed by Wu-Tang Clan member Ghostface Killah. Killah never officially released the song, but he's a big Iron Man fan, and even had a cameo that was cut from the film. Finally, we're introduced to the Jericho missile, powered by repulsor technology, which is the same tech Tony famously used in his hands in the Iron Man suit. Also, these Jericho missiles are completely unrelated to the real-life Israeli missile system of the same name. Just saying. Like the walls of Jericho coming down, Tony ends up in a cave with Ho Jensen, an engineer and surgeon. Jensen actually serves much of the same role as he does in the first origin story, though in that he is Vietnamese, in keeping with the Vietnam War theme and all that. He mentions he's from the fictional town of Gulmera, and that he's met Tony before, which is all important later. But even stranger than fiction is the organization that has kidnapped Tony, the 10 Rings. Longtime comic fans will recognize the group name as the set of jewelry belonging to Iron Man's comic book arch nemesis, the Mandarin. He would show up in Iron Man 3, but significantly different from his origins. In the comics, the Mandarin is powered by 10 alien rings, but for the movies, the rings refer to different branches of the same organization. And talking about organizations and cells, let's address how disorganized the subtitles are in this movie. The primary language spoken in the film by the group is Urdu, though it's mentioned they speak a variety of other languages. Why do we bring this up? Because like many films, some of the translations in this movie are wrong. Here, let's post the corrected ones for you. You don't even need a magic auto-translator for this one.
I'm nice like that.
Enjoy.
ये खित्ता लोगों के सफेद हड्डियों से भरा हुआ है जिन्होंने हमारा अज़म और यकीन पर शक किया और मगरिबी हमेशा इस दुनिया पर हुकूमत करता रहे लेकिन हम जिनको तुम वहशी दरिंदे समझते हो वीरान और बंजर कोनों में इस खातिर जमा हो रहे हैं
यहाँ पर असल में क्या हो रहा है
कुछ नहीं चला सिर्फ काम
बहुत वक्त गुजर गया हथियार कहाँ
बहुत मेहनत कर रहा है लेकिन मुश्किल काम रहे
साफ साफ बताओ यहाँ क्या हो रहा है
कुछ भी नहीं
अभी बताओ
Speaking of a thing, palladium is a real element, atomic number 46. Look it up, kids. Can it power your homemade Iron Man cosplay? No, but it is used in everything from jewelry to photography. They even mention it in Jessica Jones, like it's a big deal or something.
Palladium hardware.
But you know whose homemade cosplay paid off? Tony's. As we're finally introduced to the Mark I Iron Man suit, which actually does a pretty dang good job of pulling off the comic look. Jensen pulls out some awesome patriotism during his death when the American flag can be seen behind him. This scene would later be mirrored in Captain America: The First Avenger, when the man who helped create Cap, Dr. Erskine, would die shortly after mentoring the hero and reminding him to stay who he was. Once Stark is rescued by Rhodes. Wait, did Rhodes wait 3 months to make that fun bee joke?
How was the fun bee?
Anyway, Tony heads home and decides he wants an American cheeseburger, brought to him courtesy of Burger King. Paramount and Burger King have had a long-standing relationship, just ask the Transformers franchise. But there's more to the inclusion of the grilled patties than just a sponsorship. As most people know by now, Robert Downey Jr. had a substance abuse problem, and the character of Tony Stark was credited with saving his career. But Downey also credits Burger King as part of his sobriety, as a crappy burger and soda convinced him to toss his drugs into the ocean and get clean. At the press conference where Tony decides that pacifism is the way for him, he asks everyone to sit down, which wasn't scripted, it was Downey's idea. Just like the idea that SHIELD's acronym didn't exist in this film. Agent Coulson here calls the organization
Strategic Homeland Intervention Enforcement and Logistics Division.
God, you need a new name for that.
Yeah.
A running joke in the film, one which he says they are working on. This would be contradicted in future MCU projects where the acronym SHIELD had been around since at least the late 40s, as shown in the canonically debated Agent Carter one-shot. And who loves the 40s? Phil Coulson, of course. Actor Clark Gregg was originally brought in to be a nameless agent, but won the filmmakers over. And as history has shown, Coulson would play a major role in Avengers, get his own spin-off show, and be introduced into the comics and animation. Another brilliant piece of animated gestures happens when Stane references his occupation as an ironmonger.
That's what we do. We're ironmongers. We make weapons.
A nod to his comic moniker as mentioned before. And like a monger, he sits playing Antonio Salieri's Concerto in Do Maggiore per Pianoforte ed Orchestra Larghetto. What did I just say? Any of you who follow history or watch Amadeus would know that Salieri and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart were rival composers, and Salieri was thought to be a part of the reason Mozart died. How accurate that is to history is debatable and lacks evidence, but it just shows that Stark, who like Mozart is naturally gifted at his craft, is a target for Stane. And a good target needs a good targeting system, as during Tony's first suit up, we're introduced to the HUD, another reminder of how advanced Tony's tech really is. The advancements in tech would be a reoccurring part of the Iron Man armor in subsequent films, but in this one we're taking baby steps, as we meet the Mark II armor, an all-silver prototype. Unlike the comics, the Mark II here is all silver, whereas in the books, it's a golden version of the Mark I. Tony would keep racking up the marks, going all the way to 50 by the time he faces off against Thanos. His collection would come to be known as the Hall of Armors. Is this guy just made of money?
I need it.
But we're not done with the Mark II yet, as later in the film, Rhodes gives it a look over and says the line,
"Next time, baby."
A reference to it eventually becoming the War Machine suit, which is mostly black and silver. This all comes to a crashing halt when Tony falls flat on his face and we see him icing his left arm. We'll have to backtrack for a second. As each appearance of Mr. Stark progresses, fans will notice Tony taking hold of his left appendage on numerous occasions. In this film alone, his left arm is injured 4 separate times, which means that Tony could be suffering from long-term harm to his body.
My left arm is numb. Is that normal?
And it all started right here. Was this intentional?
Kill power.
Probably not at first, but considering the events of Infinity War, we'll keep you appraised if it's relevant at all or not. Stark then tells Jarvis to add some Hot Rod Red to the armor, finally giving us the classic Iron Man color palette, red and gold, or yellow, depending on your printer. Stark switches to this modern look in Tales of Suspense 48 in 1963 after Mr. Dahl takes control of the Mark II, and the look stuck. Tony heads to the Walt Disney Concert Hall, which is ironic since just a few short years later, Disney would own this franchise. And speaking of mistaken ownership, Stark mistakenly refers to this guy as Hugh Hefner, when we all know it's none other than Stan Lee and his first Stanmio in the MCU. Later, Stark heads to the fictional Golmera to do some butt kicking, but ends up being mistaken for a UFO. And we don't mean alien. Literally what the acronym means, kiddies. The two jets tailing him have the call sign Whiplash 1 and 2. Whiplash is a reoccurring Iron Man villain who later appears as the villain in Iron Man 2, partially. After Tony survives this escapade, Stane watches his dreams go up in smoke while playing chess.
You're messing with my Zen thing, man.
Obi was a fan of chess in the comics so much that he brought together a group of assassins he called the Chessmen in the comics. He goes to see some older evil ringed friends and uses a neat little piece of Stark tech to immobilize the guy. This and other Stark tech would be referenced in other MCU media, particularly Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., where the mini-bombs Coulson uses later show up too. And while we're on the Stark tech, did you catch a prototype of Captain America's shield hiding in the back right here. This obviously isn't Cap's real vibranium shield, but at the time it was a cool little nod to his fellow Avenger. Anyway, Stane wants a prototype suit of his own, like a pouty child, and speaks to this scientist William Ginter Riva. This is the film's executive producer, Peter Billingsley, who you know better as Ralphie from A Christmas Story. And yes, he shaved his head for that look. He gets impatient. Things are said, bad guys are out there, and eventually Obi dons his own suit, which is never called the Ironmonger in the film. And the first thing he does is chase Pepper down a tight hallway, a sequence that would be mimicked in the first Avengers when the Hulk chases Black Widow down in a similar manner. As Stark comes to the rescue and we reach the inevitable, actually, one of the only 3 real fight sequences in the film, come to think of it. Anyway, a building in the background declares it's part of the Roxxon Corporation. In the comics, Roxxon is an oil company that is usually involved in shady dealings, and the ownership shifts from baddie to baddie. Of significant note is that it was suspected 2 Roxxon agents in the comic killed Tony's parents. Its outreach in the MCU extends into the broader MCU, particularly on TV, and specifically a big role in the show Agent Carter. Stane is then blown up, which was an explosive shocker to Jeff Bridges, who said his character was supposed to survive when he was initially hired. The film ends with Tony at a press conference, where he is coached into telling the press Iron Man is his bodyguard. Tony thinks this is shaky, but he's incorrect, as in the comics, Iron Man's cover story was that he was Stark's bodyguard until Iron Man Volume 3, number 55 in 2002, when Tony comes out publicly shortly before becoming Secretary of Defense. Since then, Tony has openly been Iron Man in the comics, which is what this movie runs with, as Tony publicly reveals himself as Iron Man. This would ripple throughout the MCU, where the heroes don't have traditional secret identities. Jon Favreau would say this was done by Marvel to keep the genre fresh, as secret identities were overdone. But secrecy can be important, so to keep this ending a secret, extras on set were told this was a dream sequence. And finally, we come to what would be a staple in the MCU franchise: the first post-credits sequence. This scene features Nick Fury, who we saw previously at the end of Captain America 1, but since this is his first appearance release-wise, let's talk about him here. Though Marvel's mainstream universe, the 616 universe, currently has a Nick Fury based on Samuel L. Jackson, we have to jump back 2002. Mark Millar's Ultimates #1 introduced the first African-American Nick Fury, Ultimates being set in a different universe than the 616. Fury was physically designed to look like Samuel L. Jackson and even references it in the comics. And thus it came true 6 years later, when Jackson was brought in to play Fury in this cameo. And speaking of the cameo itself, Fury's dialogue was written by comic legend Brian Michael Bendis. Unknowingly and ironically, this dialogue would come to define the future of the franchise. It's funny how a small cameo showed there was enough interest for a crossover film event, when it would change the way modern cinema was made today. You would think DC would have done this years ago with Batman and Superman, but why would you think the 2 biggest superheroes of all time in a single movie would work?
You know, you may not be a threat, but you better stop pretending to be a hero.
Such an unrealistic concept, right?
Call it, Captain.
Leave your comments in a cave in the desert. We'll mod them to our pleasure. Please like, subscribe, and follow us to Gomera. We know it's fictional, but apparently Afghanistan is right outside my door. This has been Avengers Treasures. I'm Christian Villarreal, and you've been watching The Fortress of Dorkness.